Hello, everyone, and welcome to part one of my reader's guide to the collection of poetry I've entitled When the Eye Forms. My name is Dwaine Rieves, and I authored this book following years of practicing medicine in a couple of places, and those places provide the fodder for almost all the poems in the book. In this first part of the reader's guide, I'm going to discuss a small backstory to the book, one that largely by serendipity alone happened to encapsulate the major theme of the book, which, no surprise, concerns the nature of vision. And by vision, I mean vision as optically witnessing, of course, and also vision as a metaphor for narrative formation or story making, which is a key component, I think, of belief. So, in a sense, this book is a kind of visual physiology expressed in poems, a physiology in which vision is a two-step process, vision as beholding, and vision as the process of trying to make sense of all we've seen. The book opens with an epigram from Walt Whitman's 1860 version of Leaves of Grass. As Whitman writes in section 22, locations and times, what is it in me that meets them all, whenever and wherever, and makes me at home? Forms, colors, densities, odors, what is it in me that corresponds with them? In this lyric, Whitman is questioning himself, asking himself why and how he keeps returning to the world he's seen and tried to understand. I didn't know it when I wrote this poetry book, but Walt Whitman's connection to When the Eye Forms goes beyond this small excerpt from Leaves of Grass. And it's this incidental connection, this backstory of Mississippi and Walt Whitman that I want to share today. And to get started, I need to mention the two settings for When the Eye Forms. The first place is Natchez, Mississippi in 1983. And the second place is Washington, D.C., 2 decades later, shortly following the turn of the millennium. The book is largely grounded in Natchez, building upon my adventures in the Adams County Health Department, which, when I was there, was housed in a 1940s era colonial-style building on North Union Street. I came to Natchez when I was 29 years old, just out of university training in internal medicine. The state of Mississippi had paid my way through medical school, and as part of my repayment commitment, the state had now assigned me to work in the Natchez area. As many people from the South know, Natchez is an old river town, which the European colonialists settled even prior to the creation of New Orleans. The settlement of Natchez was likely influenced by the area's geography, which consisted of a gently tiered bluff abutting the river, an embankment feature that was to become an ideal spot for steamboats to dock as they traveled up and down the Mississippi. In fact, Natchez was such a key docking point in the steamboat travel business. Several state maps from the 1840s highlight the distance from Natchez to cities such as Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and New Orleans. The action in my Walt Whitman backstory begins when steamboat travel on the Mississippi was booming. In 1848, the war with Mexico had ended, and New Orleans was bustling with the hullabaloo of returning military and military-related businesses. Walt Whitman, who was then a 28-year-old firebrand of a Brooklyn newspaper journalist, had gained a reputation as a major cheerleader for the spread of the American way of life across the North American continent, including to Mexico. But Whitman's all American belly-aching and general irascibility may have contributed to the loss of his Brooklyn newspaper job. This firing, which he capitalized upon by striking out from New Orleans. Well, following a couple of weeks in journeying from New York to New Orleans, the young Whitman found work as a founding writer for the New Orleans Crescent newspaper. He was proud of his new position, but he didn't last long at this newspaper job either. Indeed, after 3 months in New Orleans, the restless and homesick Whitman headed back up the Mississippi River. Public records do not document Walt Whitman spending time in Natchez, at least not the records I can locate. But the town of Natchez definitely left an impression on the young poet, an imprint on his life that suggests his steamboats likely docked in the city, for at some point he picked up a Natchez newspaper. Whitman then memorialized Natchez in his memory by keeping portions of the town's newspaper with him for the remainder of his life. The Mississippi Free Trader and Natchez Gazette. Get that name right, Mississippi Free Trader and Natchez Gazette. Whitman must have closely examined the newspapers from Natchez during his travels because he ultimately carefully clipped one of its advertisements, pasting this ad to a sheet of paper which he kept on his desk during the last years of his life. The clipped newspaper advertisement is now stored in the Library of Congress, not so very far from here. And the document includes Whitman's own ink cursive, confirming that he took the ad from the Natchez newspaper. After Whitman died, his literary executor, Horace Trobel, wrote of the Natchez token in his biography of the old gray poet. As Trobel writes in his book, I read the memorandum W. had preserved, a for sale advertisement from the Natchez Free Trader of May the 11th, 1848. I read it aloud. Negroes for sale. I have just arrived from Missouri with 10 Negroes, which I will sell at a bargain for cash. I have several boys about 21 years of age that are very likely strictly number one fine seamstress and house servant, very likely. Those who wish to purchase and will buy the lot, I will most certainly give a great bargain. Signed, Asa Thompson, who's doing business down at the Forks of the Road selling point in Natchez. And in response to hearing the old advertisement recited back to him, Walt Whitman says, Horace, 1,000 years of history have been lived in the 40 years since Mr. Thompson advertised his bargains in human souls. It is a good thing to keep around as a reminder, yes, a warning. The dying Walt Whitman's advice to retain the record of what he had beheld on his trip down the Mississippi River illustrates the impact of this trip upon his vision of America. Up until then, Whitman had been a champion of American cultural and economic expansion. As the young Whitman had written in the Brooklyn Eagle, America knows how to crush as well as how to expand. And there was an exclamation point after that. But the river trip opened Whitman's eyes. In the earliest photograph of Walt Whitman, which is a daguerreotype taken in New Orleans, the young newspaper man is holding his head as if thinking heavily about what he is beholding on his trip, as if he needs to understand the system of American enterprise better. It is the grand perplexement reflecting in the reshaping of Whitman's writing, his focus now as much or more on the American individual rather than evangelism for the American way of life. In the first edition of Leaves of Grass, Whitman opens the book with an image of himself as a confident, reconciled man, his hands at his side and positioned as if he needs to now tell a more truthful story, and he'll proudly tell it. The story of a changing poet as well as a changing nation. For as Whitman writes, I am the haunted slave. I wince at the bite of the dogs. I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person. My hurt turns livid upon me as I lean on a cane and observe. Places and the visions evolving from changing places is a theme of the opening poem in When the Eye Forms. And the poem goes like this. Places, working, the County Health Department, Natchez, Mississippi, 1983. I was eager to leave. Career, cities, good places to live. One day, in clinic, a young mother, I asked where you and your baby live. We stay, you answered, out canal. And you meant it. Years later, answers. Yours came back in my Washington, D.C. gay men's clinic when one patient, you describing yourself, your Mississippi drawl, proud of what a high-end escort sees. Given the quick treatment, you stood to leave as the beeper, yours sounded, as your face turned, you watching long-distance numbers I once saw in dreams, San Francisco, New York, Dallas. Doc, you wouldn't believe the places I stay. You, beaming, as all my Mississippis forgave, all my cities forgot. Places where we lived, I thought. You telling yet how we stayed. You, I say. I also think another poem from early in the book illustrates the power as well as the complexity of our vision physiology and how our perspectives can be profoundly altered by our beholding, our witnessing, as well as the nature of the places in which we find ourselves. The poem is entitled Another Song, and it was inspired by an incident in the waiting room of our old health department building. I happened to be walking by the waiting room when, among the packed rows of mothers and their kids, I recognized a lady sitting there with her young adult son. She and her son were among my most intriguing patients, in large part because they lived deep in Wilkinson County, way out in the woods, in an area that meshes into what folks down there called Cajun country. The son, who only spoke Cajun French, was about 20 years old and had congenital heart disease as well as a learning disorder. And here at the health department, we periodically work to help the family with routine follow-up tests and general checkups, supplementing his far fancier and more necessary health care from clinics down in Baton Rouge. And here he was. And as I stood there chatting with the mom, her son dropped the coins he had been jiggling around in his hands. And of course, one of the coins rolled beneath the big old red Coke machine, the Coca-Cola machine over in the corner. So the young man hopped up quickly, then dropped himself to the floor, spread himself on the floor, full eagle on the scruffy gray tile before us all there as the wide-eyed little kids all around him kept watching there as all the mothers fixed their eyes on him calmly, as if they understood what he was doing, as if they were not surprised at all, as if they knew there was a hidden place where all their kids were healthy. And so these mothers were also reaching for this hidden place on the cold clinic floor. There's a line from the poem that has stayed with me for years. The line is a simple phrase: so many mamas alive and watching. So many mamas. Here's the poem. Another song. He sits in the waiting room, his hands coupled like a toy rattle. Inside, coins are clinking. Turning 9 at 20, he wears a syndrome's face. His eyes, too mysterious, some say Mongolian smiles. His heart, a clamoring reed, its master valve, leaking. Suddenly, his coins fall, nickels on the floor, rolling the length of a man into the black space at the base of a Coke box hum. A lurch, a whole body drop. He follows, cheek slick with tile, eyes below the old red machine, coning a dark spot where his nickels stopped. The waiting crowd mostly smiles, as if to say they're all like this. We all are, chasing little things, suspecting coins, crawls, shoes talk. A world flat, how they stare into puddles, missing clouds, things reflected, but watching like he watches. Baseboard places where dropped coins hide. And down there, in a flea's lacy decay, the dust world is probably frantic, anxiously muffling each shiny coin with asbestos and dried spider legs. I suppose every world must redress its members, must soften the inconsistent voice. Still, no unsingable lyric survives in a room of only well-tuned ears, a room where buses pass on the street outside, their side posters shouting perfection, those smooth muscle boys sulking in New York underwear. No, in this room, so many are waiting, so many mamas alive and watching. A man has spread himself across the floor, arms reaching, hands open. And in the underworld, I know as they know, there is a voice definitely singing. Thanks for sharing this world and its hidden places with me. You, I say.